Greetings. I'm Brother Bryant from the Congregation of Israel, the Biblical School of Global Liberation for all oppressed peoples. I am also a representative of the NMP, the Nazarene Messianic Party, and I would like to welcome everyone back to another installment of our book reading and dialogue, where we're dialoguing and reading on a book by author Paulo Freire titled Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This would be our seventh week, and we're still in chapter one. We've been getting some very good information and very good dialogue from other comrades who join us in the discussion around this literature. So, nothing is too much different. We're going to start off, as we always do, with the psalm, and then we'll get into a recap. But without further ado, I'm going to be starting off with Psalms 126 this evening. Excuse me. Psalms 126 in the King James Version. And it reads, "When the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter and our tongue with singing. Then said they among the heathen, the Lord hath done great things for them. The Lord hath done great things for us, whereof we are glad. Turn again our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him." And that was Psalms 126. Psalms 126. Okay, so without further ado, I'm just going to do a quick recap. Well, it won't be so quick. It's going to be in a timely fashion, but just had a couple of things to bring out because last week I kind of just read through and I didn't really break down or really discuss a lot of what was said. A lot was going on. I was recovering from a little common cold there, a couple of family issues. So I just kind of skimmed through it. Unfortunately, I'm not proud of that, but I did. But it's okay because this week I'm going to go and just really quick review this. So I had wrote something real quick though, and this is kind of like be a segue to the recap. But I had wrote uh 2,000 years ago, the Jews understood the adversary known as Satan is and was manifested by way or through oppressive systems or social orders by the ruling class or quote unquote the mighty ones. And through careful study at the school, I began to see that Satan and some Jews and the Romans sought to kill Christ, and they accomplished their task, yet we see Christ did not cooperate because he rose from the grave, commonly called the resurrection. And Mr. Freire in this book mentions time and time again this new man, or I would say a resurrected man, who has risen from his old way of thinking and being into a new man, solely dedicated to the liberation of humanity and the planet, no longer learning or seeking ways in which to oppress and exploit, but now seeking only liberation of himself and others. So I know when comrade brother RJ was reading, we were looking at what's it called? We were looking at this new man, and I'm not going to go all the way back and recap that. I'm just going to start off where I left off last week, but I just want to keep in mind this new man or this resurrected man, or I'm sorry, someone wanted to say something, or maybe that was somebody coming in the room. This new creature which is in Christ, if you will. So real quick, give me 1 second because I think someone is trying to get into the room. I'm not sure. I don't see them. I saw Comrade Kevin, but I'll continue on because I'm not sure. I guess others can let them in if necessary. Let me keep going. Okay, so what you call it? I wanted to start off last week where I stopped at, and actually where I stopped at last I had mentioned, I'm not sure what it is in you guys' book, but in my book, the paperback is page 33. And I had mentioned a, a status. Someone has their mic unmuted. Okay. Oh, and for just for clarity or for like future reference, if anybody wants to say anything, please, if I don't see your hand raised, by all means, just come right on in, and you know how we get down. We just come in and we speak our piece. But okay, I wanted to start off on page 33, where Mr. Freire mentioned at the bottom, and I'm going to work my way back to where I first originally started the reading this. So that's why I'm going backwards. But he had mentioned at the bottom of page 33, it says, a sadistic love is a perverted love, a love of death, not of life. One of the characteristics of the oppressor consciousness and its necrophilic view of the world is thus sadism. And I even heard Elder mention last week before we signed off how that would be interesting to talk about. So what I first wanted to do, as us being wordsmith, I wanted to look at the word sadism, and then we're going to look at the word necrophilic, and then we're going to try to kind of like bring those definitions, or just the idea of the definition, into what Mr. Freire is saying. So this is sadism out of the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. It says a derivation of sexual gratification from the infliction of physical pain or humiliation on another person. Definition 2 mentions delight in cruelty. Then it says, example B, extreme cruelty. So we see that sadistic is this delight in cruelty or extreme cruelty, right? Or gratification from the infliction of physical pain or humiliation on another person. And real quick, I just want to grab the definition for necrophilic. 1 second. I have it already. I'm just seeing where I placed it at. Give me 1 second. Bear with me. I thought I had it. Well, let me just get it real, because I thought I had it. And again, just trying to give clarity to what's being said that Mr. Freire is bringing out. So this is the definition of necrophilia out of the Merriam-Webster. It says, obsession with an unusually erotic interest in or stimulation by corpses, right? So if you read above that sentence, it says, the pleasure in complete domination over another person or other animate creature is the very essence of the sadistic drive. Another way of formulating the same thought is to say that the aim of sadism is to transform a man into a thing, something animate into something inanimate, since by complete and absolute control, the living loses one essential quality of life and freedom. So when Mr. Freire mentions this, he kind of shows you, and I mean, he goes on in almost all the book and shows you how to the oppressor, the oppressed become, like he just mentioned, inanimate, or they almost become, void of life. They're dead. They're like corpses. They're objects. So the oppressor, he gets some kind of gratification, some kind of twisted gratification from dominating and from almost crushing, not even almost crushing, but crushing these inanimate objects. And it causes a stimulation, because sometimes we realize, especially in this society, um, uh, the most strange and absurd things can cultivate in the mind, being that we live in such if you will, I don't want to use the word wicked, but such a wicked society. Anything can start to become an interest, or stuff can start to spark our minds that usually, would be perverse, right? We would see that as perverse. Because I remember years ago, I heard about it was a guy, I think either I want to say not Ted Bundy, Ed Gein. He was interested in corpsing, mutilating corpse and doing all kind of explicit acts with corpse and stuff like that. So we see that in this society, we see ranges, we see variety of mental illnesses, right? And the capitalists, they share these mental illnesses, whereas though human beings are no longer, sufficient to be alive in their presence. They rather human beings be dead and void of life. And that way they can dominate and control them the way they want to. It's like a dead body. A person is dead, you can distort and do whatever you want to them because the person can't fight back. They have no life in them. So this is the same way the oppressors engage with the oppressed as corpses that, we don't have no say so. We don't have no rule over ourselves. Therefore, we're in other words, abused. Did someone want to say something? Okay, I'll continue. I'm going to read up a little bit. It says, this tendency of the oppressor consciousness to inanimate everything and everyone it encounters and its eagerness to possess unquestionably corresponds with the tendency to sadism. Again, we read what sadism was. I underlined some more. I said, well, what Mr. Freer says, if others do not have more, it is because they are incompetent and lazy. And worst of all, is their unjustifiable ingratitude towards the generous gestures of the dominant class, precisely because they are ungrateful and envious. The oppressed are regarded as potential enemies who must be watched. And the reason why I underlined that, I wanted to bring out the point, is when he mentioned if others do not have more, it's because they are incompetent and lazy. And worst of all, there is unjustifiable ingratitude towards the generous gestures of the dominant class. I remember Comrade Josiah was bringing out last week about how others may not have more because early on, Mr. Freer mentions about taking these risks. And he said maybe others haven't taken the risk to exploit or rob or defraud. Others haven't took the risk to steal and cheat. So sometimes they hit us with that we're lazy, we don't work hard enough. But I remember one time Mr. Marley mentioned how it's just a rat race. You know what I mean? It seems as if the more you do work or the more you do labor, then we all know that how the game goes. They send up minimum wage. The next thing you know, the price of commodities go up. So inadvertently, I believe that a lot of people, they start to recognize the rat race and say, look, man, I'm only going to do what's necessary, right? But along with that, we still see what's going on. We still see people being exploited, and we complain and we protest about it. But immediately, how the oppressor matches us is, well, y'all lazy, y'all not working hard enough. But that's not the case. We understand that it's a rat race. We understand that no matter how much we work, if we don't rob, if we don't exploit, if we don't take those risks to dominate, in other words, then we only going to be but so far in this quote unquote society, right? We won't have as much as others have. So we start to realize that it's not necessarily us being lazy. It's just that it's not a fair shot. The resources which the oppressors control, um, they kind of make it almost impossible to obtain them. In other words, like the factories and the machines that make the commodities that we have in today's society, they're not for sale. You can buy into them, right? And you can, maybe invest or whatever like that. But the way the capitalist mode of production is ran, where I'm talking about these big outfitters that supply the steel and supply the glass and metal for our automobiles and stuff, those outfitters are not for sale. So in other words, the capitalists, they're not to be bargained with. You can't buy them. You know what I mean? So this thing of being lazy, it's not really an issue of being lazy. It's just that you can never reach the heights or the feats where they are unless you rob or steal or unless you join in with them. Okay. So that's why I underlined that. Keep moving along, just going with the recap. At the top of the same page 33, I underline where it mentions humanity is a thing. And it says, and they possess it as an exclusive right, as inherited property. To the oppressor, consciousness, the humanization of the others, right? The others meaning the oppressed of the people, appears not as the pursuit of full humanity, but as subversion. And I'm not going to go into the definition of subversion, but to just make it, general, subversion goes into overthrown or, overthrowing an established order. So let me read that again for you. It says, to the oppressor, consciousness, the humanization of the others. So the oppressed becoming more conscious, right? More aware, right? Or becoming humanized, right? It appears not as the pursuit of full humanity. It doesn't appear as the pursuit of full humanity to the oppressor. No, what it looks like to the oppressor is subversion or ready to be overthrown by the oppressed. So that's why they don't encourage our full humanity. And when I have a scripture when I want to bring out too, because the oppressor looks at humanity as a thing, but also I wanted to say is that when it comes to this deal with humanity, I'm starting to realize for the oppressed, right? We talk about the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I think another comrade that mentions, RJ mentioned, so maybe the elder had mentioned this, that the humanity also becoming human, excuse me, it also involves becoming educated and coming out of ignorance. So we gain our humanity by becoming educated, by leaving ignorance, right? By becoming more literate, we become human, right? Because that's what he just mentioned, how to the oppressed consciousness or awareness of the condition, right? I'm adding that in there, but it says to the oppressor consciousness, the humanization of the others are the oppressed or the barbarians or whatever you want, whatever they call us, the native people, right? Of the people appears not as the pursuit of full humanity, but as subversion or overthrowing. So when we start to educate ourselves and start to really realize what's going on, then to the oppressor, they feel as though that we're ready to cause revolution or overthrow them. So educating ourselves is a threat to them. So that's why he mentions down the paragraph I read before, the oppressed are regarded as potential enemies who must be watched. That's why constantly they're always doing census and they want to see how many people are in the neighborhood. I'm just giving examples. I'm just giving one example, but they do many other things. They make many other feats and attempts to watch us and keep an eye on us because they're always paying attention to the education apparatus and what we are educating. That's why on your phone, I realize if you got a phone, quick example, if you have a phone and you got it from the store, if you don't put an email in that phone, as far as I understand, you cannot use YouTube and all these other different things because they want that phone to go back to a person, because whatever you watch on YouTube, whatever you watch on the internet, they want to be watching it. They want to keep an eye on it. So as far as I understand, all the cell phones that I ever had, especially when it comes to Android, I'm not sure about the iPhone, maybe with the iPhone too. If you purchase a phone, and we all use our phones to get online and we watch and we read stuff like we do right now with our phones on Zoom, right? And we sign into our emails or our iCloud accounts, whatever. And if you don't do that, especially with the Android, then you cannot use YouTube at all. Not that I know of. You know what I mean? Even when you and maybe if you go on Safari or search something like that, you maybe can. But as far as the app, I've never seen it. Like certain apps you can't use, especially when it comes to interacting with the world, like Facebook and stuff like that. You have to have an email account because all that ties back to you, to the individual who you are, and they can get all your information because they have to keep their eye on us. They're watching us to see what you're saying, to see what you're thinking, and stuff like that. So and so. But real quick, I wanted to bring out because they mentioned, well, the oppressor believes that humanity is just a thing. It's like this frivolous thing. I wanted to bring out what God said in the book of Job. Just a real quick verse, Job chapter 12 and verses 10. Because to them, humanity is a thing. But God says in the book of Job, chapter 12, verse 10, it says, in whose hand is the soul of every living thing and all the breath of mankind. So humanity is not really a thing to God, right? Humanity is everything to God. We read this in the book of Genesis, how God created man. God created man in his image and stuff like that, with his intellect and things of that nature. So when we look at humanity, humanity is not a thing. Humanity, as far as what I understand, what I've been taught and learned, that humanity is enjoying this creation and coming into relationship with the creator, the power of heaven, and also walking or having an existence in which the power of heaven would approve of, right? So humanity is not just this thing where we work and we labor and we slave. That's not humanity. But the oppressor feels as though that's humanity, but it's actually not. But moving along, I got a couple of more that I want to go over. A couple more points, excuse me. On pages 32 at the bottom paragraph, it mentions money is the measure of all things, and profit the primary goal. For the oppressors, what is worthwhile is to have more, always more, even at the cost of the oppressed having less or having nothing. And a scripture came to my mind. It's actually in Philippians, I believe. But it came to my mind because it says, money is the measure of all things, and profit the primary goal. So I wanted to get this Philippians real quick here. Bear with me one second. I'm getting the scripture, so if anybody would like to say something or you have the floor. It doesn't take me but a second, but if you like to say something, then you got it. But so you guys know, I believe I'm going to Philippians 3, but give me 1 second. Okay, yeah, this is Philippians 3 and verses 19 to 21. And I'm just going to read 19 and 20 probably, or just verse 19. This remind me of when it says money is the measure of all things and profit their primary goal. It says Philippians chapter 3 verses 19, whose end is destruction. So those who money is the measure of all things and the profit is the primary goal. I looked at it when the scripture says whose end is destruction. Those who think like that, their end is destruction. Whose God is their belly. See, that's all they worry about is profit. All they worry about is consumption. You know what I mean? Money is their goal. And whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. So this is what we're reading in the scriptures about these kind of people, right? We don't see anything, where the Lord delights in these kind of people that think like that. People that think with the sadist thought or the necrophilic thought. We don't see that. We know God is the God of the living, not the dead. You know what I mean? God desires that we have life and life more abundantly. But the oppressor, he likes to inanimate things. He likes to make things in a way where it's dead. It's almost a corpse to him, right? He likes to inflict extreme cruelty. The Lord mentions to us in the book of Psalms and other passages of the Bible about violence, even in the Proverbs about doing violence, about abstaining from violence. But they love cruelty. They love violence. We see the oppressor. This is one of his characteristics, as Mr. Freire had mentioned. But going back some more, just real quick, bringing out some more points from last week that I just wanted to talk about. On pages 31, I'm going to read this really quick because I want to bring out something. It says, but even, I'm at the last paragraph. It says, but even when the contradiction is resolved authentically by a new situation established by the liberated laborers, the former oppressors do not feel liberated. On the contrary, they genuinely consider themselves to be oppressed, conditioned by the experience of oppressing others. Any situation other than their former seems to them like oppression. And he goes to mention how formerly they could eat, dress, wear shoes, be educated, travel, and hear Beethoven, while millions did not eat, had no clothes nor shoes, neither studied nor traveled, much less listen to Beethoven. Any restriction on this way of life in the name of the rights of the community appears to the former oppressor as a profound violation of their individual rights. And when I thought about this, I said, man, well, how do you resolve that? Because it's kind of like, yeah, that I get that. Like once when the oppressed, they get back, well, not because Mr. Freire mentions to us not changing poles. We don't want to change poles necessarily. In other words, the oppressors don't want to become the oppressed. But once when we start this pedagogy, this education where we liberate the oppressed and then we liberate the oppressor may feel as though once he's in our position that now he's being oppressed because he can't listen to Beethoven and travel and do these other things. But I thought about what Mr. Freire mentioned all the way back in pages 27. And he mentioned reflection. And the individual or the oppressor who feels as though that they're being oppressed because now they're in the same condition that everyone is in, or they're in the common condition, I would call it, right? We all in a common position. There's no more class struggle. The oppressor, because of his old, not his old, but because of what he's inherited in his mind from the old society, he might feel as though that, man, this is oppression. I don't want to be here. But he hasn't done what Mr. Freire mentioned in pages 27. I'm gonna read it real quick. It says, but action is human only when it is not merely an occupation, but also a preoccupation. That is, when it is not dichotomized from reflection. I brought that up because I started to understand that the individual or the oppressor who once when we go to stage 2 of our liberation, who sees himself as being oppressed now because he can't listen to Beethoven, because he's not free to travel, because he has to work towards the common good of the whole community. He feels as he's being oppressed because he hasn't done what Mr. Freire mentioned about reflection. And reflection is important to human action because it's just like with ourselves. We've all reflected and considered our lives. I know I'm only 32 years old, but I've reflected on my 20s of all the things in the not all the things, but excuse me, but on all the ways how I desired and sought after to be an exploiter or an oppressor, right? Subconsciously and consciously, right? And once when I reflected on it and I learned the scriptures over again, and I was taught, I got the education or the pedagogy, I started to realize that, man, all those ways were death. You know, I want to do this and the third, and all it did, what ultimately would have done was bring forth death, right? So the people that Mr. Freer is mentioning, these oppressors who feel as though that now they're being oppressed because, you know, they don't have all these different so-called freedoms, right? Their whole life is surrounded by the common good of the whole society. They feel as though that they can't dominate and oppress no more. Now they feel what we used to feel, what we feel in today, right? They feel oppressed, but we know that we haven't really changed poles. It's not now like the oppressed has become the oppressors. No, it's just that the oppressor has come out of his position of being the oppressor, and now he's just a common man, or he's going into this new man. He's going into this education on becoming this new man, but he doesn't like the position that he's finding himself in because he can't travel, because he can't dominate, because he can't dictate, or because he cannot inanimate other human beings anymore, right? So he feels oppressed, but he feels that way again because he hasn't done self-reflection. And Mr. Freer mentions how human action is almost, you know, is nothing without reflection, because in order to act upon something or in order to change something, you need reflection. So in order to change our current society that we live in, we have to reflect on everything, our occupations. We have to reflect on our way of thinking, like he mentioned in the book, our ethics, everything. So it's necessary that when we start to educate, or as we educate in dialogue with the oppressed and mainly the oppressor, we start to encourage them about, like he mentioned, critical intervention. Well, during critical intervention, we encourage them to go into reflection, to look on your activities as an oppressor and to see the wrongdoing in it. Because if not, you'll just feel as though when you get in our position that now you're being oppressed because you haven't done any self-reflection. But moving along, I don't want to get tied up on that too much because I thought that was very interesting that that's how the oppressor would think once he comes to our position. But yet, like Mr. Freer argued, that when we couldn't travel and go nowhere, the oppressors didn't care. You know what I mean? When we couldn't listen to Beethoven, they could care or less, right? So I found that amusing, very amusing. But a couple of more points. I underlined where it mentioned. Did anybody want to bring something out? It's just a recap. So if you guys don't want to speak right now, that's fine, because as we start the reading, or I go into the reading, it'll be more.
Are you going to go back into the idea of people being an object? So this behavior of the sadistic behavior of looking at the human being as an object, as something pretty much dead. Are you going to go back into that?
No, I wasn't planning to, but Elder, did you want to bring something out, or do you want to elaborate some more?
I think that is something that we should be aware of in our discussion with people, to bring these things to their attention. And they have examples of how we are considered objects simply in the regular field of employment, just as the capitalists extract iron ore and oil and natural gas. They extract from the human species what they call human resources. And this is the terminology they use, even with employment. An employer will go to human resources, or human resources stand between the proletariat or the worker and the capitalist. And this is important to bring the people attention, even more so, not just how they feel about it, but showing how we are just simply a resource to be used. And this is demonstrated in Exodus, where the children of Israel became just a human resource. They were just used to make more profit. And just now using Exodus, for example, just to share with the group, in Capital, Volume 1, In the chapter Simple Reproduction, this would be chapter 23. If I could just read this, just to add to what you were saying, just for something for us to think on as we try to awaken people to their situations. Showing Israel again in the Bible, it shows the elite using people as just a human resource. But this was a situation going on that Karl Marx spoke of in England or in Europe. And he says when he was uh, documenting a dialogue between capitalists and government officials on the lack of work in industry and how a lot of people are out of work. He says, can anything be worse for landowners or masters than parting with the best of the workers and demoralizing and disappointing the rest by an extended depletive immigration? So it was a lack of work, and the workers wanted to leave Europe to go find other work in other places. So this is a real situation that was going on in Europe. And so they're arguing, can the landowners, this be worse for the landowners or masters? Because at that time, they really wasn't called employers. So for the landowners and the employers, they don't want to part with the best of their workers. And they also said, and demoralizing and disappointing the rest by an extended depletive immigration, a depletion of capital and value in an entire province. So they're looking at the people as capital. They're not looking at them as human beings, but they're simply objects to be used, a human resource. And this is I forget, I have to go back for his name, but the last name is Potter. It says Potter, the chosen mouthpiece of the cotton manufacturers, distinguishes between two sorts of machinery. Both belong to the capitalist, but one stands in the factory, one stands in his factory while the other is housed in the cottages outside the factory. At nighttime and on Sundays, the one is inanimate, the other is living. The inanimate machinery not only wears out and loses value from day to day, but also much of it becomes out of date so quickly. So he's talking about why we need the human resource. The machinery, it runs out, loses value. Owing to constant technical progress, that's how it loses its value. You come up with a newer machine. But nevertheless, this is the point I would like to share. It says that it can be replaced with advantage by new machinery after a few months. With the living machinery, and that's how they're looking at the people, appendages to machines. It says with the living machinery, the reverse is true. It gets better the longer it lasts, or the worker becomes more skilled in his labor. And in proportion as the skill handed down from one generation to another accumulates. Mr. Edmund Potter is so impressed with the exceptional and supreme importance of the cotton masters that in order to preserve this class and perpetuate their profession, he would keep 500,000 of the keep 500,000 of the laboring class confined in a great moral workhouse against their will. So here he's comparing the human being, again, this human resource as just another machine. But this machine, as it works, it gains skill opposed to the other machine that's housed in a factory. And so they wanted to immigrate, if you continue to read it. And Parliament passed a bill that they were not allowed to immigrate. They wasn't allowed to leave, actually. And so this was the deal. In fact, it says the great public opinion was in fact of Mr. Potter's own opinion. It too thought that the factory workers were movable accessories to the factories. Their immigration was prevented. So they looked at them as machines, appendages to the machines in a factory. And this is what prevails today when we're looking at it real time. When people say, they may say they're just a number, but when we go into this and show how the ruling class have spoken in times past, the masters, how they're looking at the people as machines, and it correlates to this day when they call us human resources. So I think that may be helpful for some to begin to reassess, as Paulo Freire says, when you present the people their position and the cause of why they are where they are, then that helps them begin to assess their situation, this problem solving efforts in their minds to begin to reassess where they stand, where they, the reality of really where they are. And they're not really looked upon, they may get a data boy or a raise, but at the end of the day, they're simply to be used as inanimate or dead objects. With that, I'll yield.
Thank you, Elder. I appreciate it, sir. Did anybody else want to bring something out? Okay, no worries. No, I thought that was absolutely great because on page 34, Paulo Freire writes, the oppressed as objects, as things, excuse me, it says the oppressed as objects, as things, have no purposes except those their oppressors prescribe for them. So that kind of reminds me of like this correlation with the human being and the machine, right? When the capitalists, when they create these machines, right, these John Deere tractors, the John Deere tractor ain't gonna go and get a soda no time soon. It'll work all day without getting a drink of water because the capitalists or the oppressors, they have a particular job prescribed or a purpose prescribed for this machine. And now you see them looking at human beings also as these objects or things. And he writes, have no purpose except those their oppressors prescribe for them. So in other words, when we look at it in real time, right, just using common sense, according to the oppressors and the capitalists, our only purpose is to labor and make profit. We don't have no other purpose. I know a lot of us, we think that we balling and that we get money and we free. I know we hear that a lot, that well, we getting this money. But again, those same machines, these same corporations, these juggernauts, right? They're not for sale. They're not for sale. You can buy into it and invest in, strengthen them, but they're not for sale. You can't sell them and then basically bankrupt them and destroy them and try to overthrow them. You can't. That's not even an option, right? Because they're not for sale. So we start to see that the only thing is for sale is ourselves, right? And when we sell ourselves, and you really don't have no choice, because if in this society, if you don't sell your labor, then we know what's going to happen to you. You're going to be under a bridge somewhere. Some people may last for a little bit without a job, but it's only but so long you're going to make it because everything costs.
Yeah.
So to the oppressor, I'm sorry, somebody
I
want to
want
say
to add
something?
this too from what you just said, just as when we bring that reality home, it's their language in the news all the time. When they dialogue with one another, Wall Street Journal, they use that word human resource, but they also use another word signifying what you just said. Um, consumer goods or consumer commodities. So they really signify on what is made for the consumer. So you won't find one of the big oil tank rigs on eBay. That's what I would say. It's things you won't find for. They have commodities specifically for consumer buying, just to confirm what you're saying. And they use that word, consumer goods. And this is their language. So the more we learn, we begin to learn their language and begin to interpret their language for others to understand their position. I'll yield.
Thank you, Elder. I appreciate it, sir. Thank you, man. Thank you. Yes, indeed. And well, that was mostly all I wanted to bring out, brothers and sisters. So I guess from here, I mean, I had some little bit more, but I don't want to stall up the reading too much for this evening, because I'm gonna try to squeeze another week out of this, because I only got a few pages for this evening. So I'm gonna try to squeeze another week out. If not, I'll just read the whole thing through and then recap next week. And just like end my reading off tonight, but just next week recap and then turn it over to another comrade, because it's not that many pages. But if we start to get some dialogue going, then we'll slow up and we'll do it a different way. But without further ado, I'm gonna start the reading, and I'm on excuse me, I'm on pages 34 at the second paragraph. I'm just gonna define a few words that don't they're not everyday words. At least some of them weren't to me. But I'll just define them real quick and place them back in the sentence, so that way it'd be more clarity for myself and maybe others that are listening. But on page 34, starting at the second paragraph, it reads, given the preceding context, another issue of indubitable importance arises. The fact that certain members of the oppressor class join the oppressed in their struggle for liberation, thus moving from one pole of the contradiction to the other. Theirs is a fundamental role and has been so throughout the history of this struggle. It happens, however, that as they cease to be exploiters or indifferent spectators, or simply the heirs of exploitation, and move to the side of the exploited, they almost always brings with them the marks of their origin. And he's going to go into it. He's going to say their prejudices and their deformations, which include a lack of confidence in the people's ability to think, to want, and to know. So again, when the oppressor joins along with the oppressed, he still has that mentality that the oppressed is inanimate. Excuse me, the oppressed is inanimate. The oppressed is an object, it's a thing. It doesn't have the ability to think. It doesn't have the ability to reason, right? So this so-called and we heard many times Mr. Fred mentioned it before, this is why the oppressor cannot lead the revolution or the liberation of the oppressed. Only the actual oppressed can lead himself to his own liberation, right? Because we're reading the oppressed comes with those same ideals or origin of thinking from when they were the oppressor, right? But continuing on, it says, accordingly, these adherents to the people's cause constantly run the risk of falling into a type of generosity as malefic as that of the oppressors. And I'm not going to grab malefic, but if you look malefic up in the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it's just going into maliciousness, right? Someone that's malicious or mischievous. So again, it says, accordingly, these adherents to the people's cause constantly run the risk of falling into a type of generosity as malicious as that of the oppressors, that false generosity that we've been reading about in previous pages. Okay, it says the generosity of the oppressors is nourished by an unjust order, right? Because I was talking about that last week, charitable deduction, and how they pretend to give back, but really what they're giving back is just our tax money that we've labored for, that they stole from us. So when they do their philanthropy and all this other kind of stuff, it's really a false generosity. They really haven't given us anything back. They just really take the money that we've paid in taxes and they pretend to do something with it, but it's all an illusion, right? It's all an illusion. And it says our converts, on the other hand, truly desire to transform the unjust order, right? But because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation because they're dominant, because of their power, because they've been told that they're the educated people, because they had the ability in the old society to rule and to exploit, they feel as though only they can execute the liberation, right? But we start to see that because they haven't really did any self-reflection, the poles just have changed. That's what Mr. Freer warned us about. They're really not going to bring true liberation. What they'll end up doing, he's going to mention it, what they end up doing is just repeating the same cycle again of oppression, right? Through their false generosity, we'll go right back into the same loop of things. Whereas though uh, uh, um, we'll still have class. To make it real simple, we'll still have class. They'll never end class. They'll never totally uproot the class struggle. It'll still be class there because again, they thinking only they can execute this because of their previous background. So now there we go into dehumanization, right? They feel as though that they're smarter than the oppressed. They feel as though, again, because they used to dominate and used to reign and rule, that they are, somewhat of a better gene pool, if you will, or whatever. But I'll keep reading. Did anybody want to bring something out? Okay, I'll keep reading. It says, but because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation. They talk about the people, but they do not trust them. And trusting the people is the indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 actions their favor without that trust. So in other words, and I always mention this before, that's what I'm actually doing now, getting better and more familiar with the Spanish language and also with French and uh, it's Creole, right? Even though Creole is like a slang, but nonetheless, though, uh, when you're engaged with the people's struggle, you're showing that real generosity. And like Mr. Lennon encouraged us, is to study the world and study the things around the world and study all the different treasures that mankind has brought forth. Learn these things, right? So when we start to struggle with our fellow proletariat, or when we start to struggle and trying to liberate ourselves with the fellow oppressed, right? We start to educate ourselves, that trust will be there because we have the knowledges, we understand. I mean, by default, it's going to be there because, of course, once when we study and once when we really seek liberation, you'll see your neighbor as yourself, right? You'll be able to trust him. You won't think that everything you're presenting to the table or bringing to the table is superior in his thoughts. No, you'll understand a lot of where he's coming from because you have studied, right? You have taken the time to educate yourself on the different conditions that men and women find themselves in. But you'll come off with true generosity. You'll come off being truly genuine to the fellow proletariat, to the fellow working class people, because you studied, you've educated yourself, you went through this pedagogy, right? So therefore, the people will be more in favor to trust you, or and vice versa, right? When you see others coming to the table, they have studied, they know the conditions that's going on, they know the different struggles that we face as far as unifying and coming together as a collective. When people recognize that, they'll be more, ready to trust you than to you to be some old boss or some, old oppressor or whatever. And because, you got a pocket full of money, or because you had a couple of companies, you think that, now you're some director and you can get everybody organized. It doesn't work like that. You have to be plain. You have to be, like Christ mentioned in the scriptures, the greatest amongst you is them that will serve. So you have to become to that meek state, right? Totally submissive to the will of God. And then we know the will of God is justice and judgment and so forth and so on. That's what he desires of man, Malachi 6:8. So we start to realize is that this is the type of person, this new man, as Mr. Freer mentioned, or the resurrected man. This is the man who coming forth from out of the working class, right? This is the man that all the other proletariats or those that labor or find themselves in exploited conditions, this is the kind of man that they will trust and that they will unify with. Okay. Did anybody want to bring something out? Okay, I'll continue on. It says, those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. This conversion is so radical as not to allow of ambiguous behavior. And I underlined that word. So real quick, I'm gonna get it because I've heard people say it all the time, and I know people probably say, "Man, brother Bryant, man, man, shoot, man, you better go back to language art school. You don't know what ambiguous mean." But I didn't know what it means, so I looked it up so I can get a better, command on, not better command, but a better control of what the sentence is saying. And it's basically doubtful or uncertain, especially from obscurity or indistinctness, or the second definition says capable of being understood in two or more possible senses or ways. So when I read it again, it says this conversion is so radical as not to allow ambiguous behavior or not to allow inexplicable behavior. You know what I mean? Doubtful or uncertain behavior, right? That's what it's saying. To affirm this commitment, but to consider oneself the proprietor of revolutionary wisdom, which must then be given to or imposed on the people, is to retain the old ways. The man or woman who proclaims devotion to the cause of liberation, yet is unable to enter into communion with the people whom he or she continues to regard as totally ignorant, is grievously self-deceived. Again, just reaffirming what I was saying, that person that thinks that everybody else is dumber than them, that's going to get into that dehumanizing individual, the individual which seeks to inanimate people or turn people into objects. Mr. Freer said that type of thinking, that person with that psychology is grievously deceived, right? Because what will happen is, because they don't trust the people, they don't feel as though that the people or the proletariat is smart enough, then it'll be nothing but what we see, ambiguous, nothing but doubtful Thomases. You'll be that person that's so-called the leader or so-called the cultivator of unifying everybody. He'll, if he comes from the oppressor class, he'll just see everybody as dumb and stupid, and there's no possible way we can do it. And then he'll take the people right back down into subjection or to exploitation, because he feels though the people, they ain't good for nothing but to be conquered and ruled over, right? So this is what Mr. Freer is bringing out to us. That's why he said that person that sees it that way is greatly deceived. He goes on to say, the convert who approaches the people but feels alarm at each step they take, each doubt they express, and each suggestion they offer, and attempts to oppose his status, remains nostalgic towards his origins. Okay. Conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Okay. That's again, I would say that's going into that new man, right? In order to be converted, it's a profound rebirth. It's that new man, or that new man comes through, or that humanity, that new human comes through education, right? That's what I was mentioning before, through this pedagogy, being educated. That new man, or that profound rebirth, happens through the process of education, right? And also through self-reflection. And self-reflection is what ultimately causes or propel you to educate yourself. When you think on what you did, you go through your conscience and you remember, consider the things that has been done by your own hands, by your own actions, right? Your human action. You think about it, you reflect on it, and then that causes you to educate yourself to do what is right. And as you start to educate yourself to do what is right, you go to that process of rebirth or becoming the new man, right? So it says conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. Again, going into your psychology, right? A new form of existence, right? They can no longer remain as they were. Only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic ways of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect, there go that word again, the structure of domination. See that? So that's what I was just explaining. There's no need to, what they said, no need to explain was already understood. It's the reflection of the structure of the domination. So when we go back and think on our actions, even mention action, we go back and think on these things, ponder, whatever you want to call it, right? Or it's on the conscience, then we can start to see where we need to improve. We can start to see what needs to be developed out of what we've been thinking or what we reflected on. Okay. Anybody want to bring something out or have any comments?
Yeah. Were you going to talk a little bit more about the rebirth?
I wasn't planning to. That you want to bring something out, Elder?
Yeah, this idea he's making reference to, um, the man or woman who proclaims devotion to the cause of liberation is yet unable to enter into communion with the people whom he or she continues to regard as totally ignorant, is grievously self-deceived. So he's talking about in in order to move towards liberation or devote ourselves to liberation, which I understand a biblical language should be making reference to salvation. We're unable to do that if we look down upon our brothers and sisters um, who may be considered ignorant according to the capitalist standards. They may be uninformed, but we all were at one time or another. But we're unable to enter into the communion with the people whom we look down on. So this idea of communion and devotion to the cause of salvation are two principles mentioned. We talk about the communion with Christ, commensality, sitting down at the table. And he argued when he went and sat with the ruling class. He says, "Who shall you bid to your feast?" And when he talked about who should be bidden to the feast are all the marginalized in the society, the poor. And we understood that the Sadducees looked upon the rest of the people as ignorant. In fact, when the disciples were teaching, they argued in the book of Acts, these are ignorant men. And then they perceived that they were disciples of the Nazarene. When the man was healed and he began to tell the Sadducees, I don't think anybody who wasn't of the power of God can do what he did for me. And they cast him out of the assembly saying, you be altogether born in sin and you gonna teach us? So what you have exactly is this type of manifestation of the ruling class, of those who have some sort of class status, look upon the people as totally ignorant. Now, the Sadducees and the Pharisees themselves were oppressed by the Romans, but they wasn't able to enter into communion with the people because of how they regarded them. But the text used different languages. So they seen the Messiah in communion with them, the prostitute, the tax collector, the sinner. And, you know, when you put everything together, even when the Messiah himself was dialoguing among the high priests or the educated, the intelligentsia, if you will, they said, how is it that he learned these things? Where did he learn this stuff from? They didn't know of him, of being any recognizable, any schools of thought that they were a part of. So what we see, this demonstration of the Messiah, he became one with the oppressed. He didn't look at them as those people. You know, we get a little bit of finances or we get a good job and we leave, right? That's just another manifestation when you leave your people. I've grown up and I've seen so-called, when they talk about Black businesses, I grew up in that transition when Black businesses were fading, but they were still in existence. And yet they carried a characteristic where they sold their goods in the neighborhood of the projects, but they lived in North Buffalo or in the suburbs. So they really wasn't one. And that's the deal, being one with the oppressed. I see he's arguing. And what that takes, he's saying, is a conversion, a profound rebirth. Why? Because the kingdom of God is within people. It's manifested within people. And he said, unless a man is born again, he can't even see the kingdom. You can't even perceive what it's about unless you go through this rebirth. unless you understand the value of people, or you follow the characteristic of the Messiah where he laid down his life for the people. And so this is what he's explaining, I believe, here. This idea of the conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. And so now it becomes a struggle for the people. You become one with them. Your desire is to educate them. You understand that they're human beings, because he's carrying on from the argument, or he's making this transition, it appears, from the mentality of the psychology of the oppressor, looking at the people as just objects to be used. And when you're looking at someone as an objects to be used, you're sort of negating their own intelligence, you see. And here it seems like he's making this transition, the opposite. This man who shall live for the people, the one who shall struggle for the salvation of the people, liberation, in other words, then we must become one with them. And I think that's a part of loving the neighbors yourself, because we'll fight like I don't know what to bring bread to our table. We'll labor to bring bread to our own tables. That's what we do. And there's nothing wrong with it to a certain extent, but we have to analyze what we're doing to provide food, shelter, and clothing. The time spent in bringing bread to our own immediate family. And then we have to reflect and say, well, do we have that same energy? Is that same spirit? Or do we have the same pull to do it for the neighbor? And that's what I think he's somewhat is explaining here, this conversion, this rebirth. And now, again, I think this is taking us in describing an aspect of the Christ or Mashiach consciousness. So with that, I'll yield.
Hey, I have a question on that. I understood that breakdown you just gave. But on the other side, don't the people who are at the bottom, don't they have to strive for that same rebirth as well, upwards? Like in many cases, like the quote unquote or so-called lower class individuals, sometimes they live in such a state of degradation that's almost opposed to humanity, where they begin to not care, not strive, not have respect for fellow man, the laws, these type of things. Don't they have to strive as well as those who are the oppressors, who we're calling to make a change as well? But don't the people at the bottom have to make it's like a meeting in the middle, almost like they have the high-minded have to come down off their high horse and involve themselves with the people with the mind state of being as one to overthrow this oppressor. And the ones at the bottom class, don't they have to come up to another state to come up out of that just vile mentality that they have?
Yeah, I'm trying to hit my unmute. Well, yeah, that's the process he's describing. It's a process. So normally what happens is that they don't know they're in a vile state. So this is what Freire is arguing. You have to present the problem to them, because they don't recognize that there even is a problem. So once they recognize it's a problem, and that's the job of the educator, to show that there's a problem here. There is what you have thought to be a reality or okay to do. Now attention must be brought. That's what the Messiah is arguing, that he come to make the blind see, because they just in a condition where, hey, this is just the way life is. This is how I am supposed to be. So once that part of the educator enters, then this is the catalyst for the persons to strive for more. So yeah, they have their part, but it's a part of this process. And I'll say this, it's pretty much like the reason why they didn't want, I read an account on why the legislators didn't want slaves to read. He said because it broadens their world. They begin to expect or to desire a higher standard of living. So as long as they live the way they live, that's their world. That's all they know. They're where they need to be, and they do the things that they believe is natural, you know. So when the educators say, well, you begin to educate them more, then they will want more. So yeah, it's all a part of that process. I don't know if anyone ever looked into Tuskegee, if I understand what's being said here. The Booker T. Washington School, he said he had to teach slaves how to actually use betting. They didn't know. They literally didn't know what betting was for. They didn't even know how to use sheets, he said, in his record of Up From Slavery. So I think this is the same condition. That's why you have this outside force, the Messiah, the God of heaven stirs up the spirit of some, and they are the catalyst to cause these people to strive for rightness. But some will and some won't. And I'll yield with that.
Yeah, I get that. Okay, like at some point in my life, I didn't know. There were things that I truly, honestly didn't know, and most of those things were gathered under the political umbrella. So those things, I didn't know. But one thing that I did know is when I was being an offense to my fellow human. And in that case, like, you would, if I'm asking God for something or for forgiveness or something, even in my lowest state, in which I didn't know I was in politically, I know that I am at least in offense morally to my fellow man, or else I would need or have to or even want or consider to talk to a higher being to ask for forgiveness about, because knowing I'm wrong in that behavior, whatever behavior I was producing, especially inside my community, like I said, to fellow humans or whatever. Now, the political aspect, I can understand that. I had no clue. Like, every day I'm learning things that are blowing my mind, and as I look back and venture back mentally, I say, "Hey, I'm guilty of that, but I really didn't know that." But one thing I did know is when I was an offense to other humans, and so that's what I was meaning. Like, okay, at some point they have to come up, at least on that aspect, and then become, learn to be educated in the other aspects as well of being oppressed and how to come up out of it.
Yeah, it's still that's your experiences, but everybody experiences aren't the same. So that was probably the environment you were shaped in. Like, for example, if my understanding that your experiences, you had your mother and father, some don't. You entering into a generation where mother and father gone. They on crack, they on dope. So it depends on our positions. So when you have even they say even a youth who are raised with mother and father, and mother and father are in their lives to a certain extent, some will call them privileged. But we have to recognize what has been set in our environments. So I know an environment that I grew up in. And then when I begin to experience other people and the things that they do or even lie, that was something different because I really wasn't in an environment like that. My aunts and uncles and my father was big on it. So it was my environment. So it's just different things I picked up. And I'll say this, they did an experiment again, where they said roughly 70 or 80% of the so-called Negro children don't believe that they don't believe they should be married. Now, these are children, like children in grade school. But then European children, they believe in marriage. I mean, they believe that's what you should do. But when you're in an environment that's creating a certain psychology, then what we may call common sense or something that people should know, that's not true. It literally depends on your environment. And that's why, again, it goes back into education because we were learned a certain way. So some will have certain morals. Some may not. Some may have certain morals to respect parents. But yet, when it comes down to relationships, they exploit women. But then you have some men no, they don't really chase women, but they have another issue somewhere. So it really depends on the environment and the manner of people. People may have pieces, but we can't necessarily gauge it all the time from where we come from, and us being in this transition, seeing our generation, those of us in our 40s and 50s, heck, them kids in their 20s and 30s, they grew up with crack mama parents. I mean, crack parents on mother and father. And that was close to home inside of my family. And their psychology is totally different, totally different. So I'll yield with that.
Yeah, you made a good point there. I can't. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm gonna just stop right there and say you're right because yeah, you got me yeah, fluttered a little bit right there because now I'm being the high-minded one. And didn't even didn't even think that I was, but yeah, that's true. Everybody doesn't have the same story. And so yeah, I do. And when you were saying that, cats was popping in my head who I know who didn't have their moral compass in my past. And so yeah, you right about that. So I'm a year right there.
Brother Judah and Brother Akish, I would like to also add to that. I was thinking about, as you were kind of talking, both of you, about even when you look at Booker T and then you look at Du Bois and them coming from different backgrounds. And somebody brought out one time, and maybe it was something that I actually read, how Booker T was actually born a slave. I mean, he was born a slave. And then at some point, as time went on, how he started, I think it was the Hampton Institute, and he wanted to just teach the basics to slaves. And the South was kind of okay with that because they felt like as long as that was all they were learning is these like manual jobs, and they wouldn't expect anymore. But you would have to also look at Booker's background versus, say, Du Bois's background, who wasn't born a slave, and how he really wanted the people to have political power. So there was a different way of educating that he wanted. And so there was this kind of I won't say conflict, but they just kind of saw things differently because they had different backgrounds. And it's like, you could even see it in that. But Booker was like, well, how can we teach them book knowledge if they don't even know the basic stuff? But then Du Bois was like, well, if they don't have the book knowledge, how are they going to have a political power? They're going to kind of be stuck in this spot. So there was this kind of back and forth, or at least they just came from a different mindset. But I think you know, I had not really, until I read it or somebody talked about it, I hadn't really thought about the idea of how they were both shaped by their respective backgrounds. How Booker was actually born a slave, but Du Bois was not born a slave. So they had a different mentality.
And in that scenario, I could see the difference there, and I could see what will be the conflict there.
Right.
Yeah, and yeah, that's one to really chew on, because maybe I'm at where I'm at now, I come hard on the youth a little bit, but I do give them a pass though. I do give them a pass depending on, you know, when we do dialogue and we talk, and I dig a little deeper, but I am overall, I would say, pretty hard on the youth and saying where y'all dropping the ball at. But then, you know, when I put myself back in their shoes, heck, at 20 something, they ain't half as, I turned 21 in prison. So y'all doing better than I was, I guess.
Yeah, we all have the, you know, these different experiences. And the youth are extremely challenged. It's I don't know if any John Gatto and the Most High willing, we'll be discussing it when we start to examine the educational systems, its intentions, and how it's training. It started to experiment and train us, and it began to train another generation where, you know, we call it this right of entitlement, but they train this generation. They're even when it comes down to stimulus and sensations, shorter attention spans, and you know, it's some work to work through, you know. And I was talking to an individual again who deal with children, talking to him, you know, deal with teenagers, and he said, as in a group, he said they're one way. So I think he dealt with about 20 to 30 kids in his programs. And he said, but when you talk to them like alone, or you really start to, you know more about them. And he said, you know, the problems, and find out what's really on their minds, you know, which, you know, they might not talk about right offhand in a group, but they really got to get into this personal setting, whether it's thoughts of suicide. Uh, he was telling me about even at lunch, you know, children who go to these lunch at school, and they, you know, some of their concerns was, you know, not being able to afford the food or the stuff that may be in the vending machines that may be a little healthier. They can't afford it, you know. And these are the conversations with, you know, it was, in one sense, it was encouraging, because you got to go through all of the mess. And it can be frustrating, because what we are dealing with, what we do see, is despicable, you know, some of their attitudes and arrogance. But, you know, sometimes, you know, you just gotta, through the grace of God, we can get through, you know, enough of them to find out who they are. And I would say this, even coming up myself, okay, I was one of the individuals who you would say that, you know, you had certain guys, you know, you're part of a certain block, you can't go over on another block. You know, you get jumped on, somebody will whoop you. You represent a certain block, you know, people know you are. But from the another perspective, growing up, you had those who they known was in knowledge, or you know, just doing something different. You're not out there trying to sell, you're not out there fighting and carrying on. And so you have these people who you can go from whatever neighborhood they want, you know, I no problem for the most part. And I knew people in all the different neighborhoods, people whose enemies. But what I realized is that when I reflect back on it, even in my 20s, the hard guys, you know, the guys who, you know, they were warriors, man. That's just, you know, they didn't talk a game, they were warriors. But when they didn't feel a threat, you know, how they will open up. So I was able to relate to them, like to the guy with the children. Because I remember the men who you couldn't get past their first barrier, you know, because they ready to fight you if you was a stranger. But when they let their guards down and they invite you to their house, you know, and you talk to them, and it is, you know, it's just really breaking down them barriers and these that they have set up in defense, lack of trust, who they can trust, everybody's scheming. So it's like this conglomerate of chaos that we sort of have to make sense of it, and then relate it to these youths and peoples, and hopefully we can gain ground where they can open up and be them and have honest conversations where they can trust. And I think this is what Fier is explaining, you know, really getting into communion with them. But I understand your sentiment. It's not easy because some of them are just downright arrogant, you know, especially the cool kids. You know, you got the cool kids, popular, but then you got a nice amount of kids who I would say the vast majority, not the cool kids, but you just got to find that way to have a serious conversation with them, you know. And I just been experimenting with it throughout the years. It's just now just developing more of a conversation. Okay, what can I really offer them, and where can I lead them? And so, you know, hopefully we can learn from one another so we can begin to gain ground in that area, because it is a hurdle for all of us to get past, especially how they've been conditioned through this present day educational system and the psychology that's coming out of these institutions. But with that, I'll yield. I started to talk, and I don't know if Brian walked away or not. I know he was kind of silent for a minute, but I'll yield. I don't know if he's back on the scene.
Oh no, excuse me. I was here the whole time. No, I was letting you guys dialogue because I know that's all a part of it. So I mean, please, by all means, if you guys wanted to bring out some more, then go right ahead. If not, I'll continue. But I was here the whole time. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to bring out? You were saying something?
No, sir. You can continue.
Yes, sir. Yes. And no, that was a great dialogue. I was hearing all the points that were made, especially when Sister Tanya had brought up about Frederick Douglass, about Booker T. Washington, and Mr. Du Bois. And you know, I was just looking at all the differences of, like when Elder Judah was having a dialogue with you, Akish, about some people that grew up inside certain households, and you know, of the drug abusers, and some who didn't. And I think that's why it's very necessary that when we see that people are coming from all different walks of life, especially these young folks, that's why it's really necessary to study, you know, like stuff like psychology, and to study the world, and to look at the different kinds of families that we find within inside of the so-called American society. You know what I mean? Whether it be, you know, middle class families, lower class families, it's good to look at all the different dynamics. So again, when we start to have these dialogues and we start to have what Mr. Freer calls critical intervention with brothers and sisters, we'll come off, you know, again, with something to offer, which is the education, but we'll also come off as very genuine. We'll also come off as how I feel Christ came off to his disciples, as if I really care. I'm not just trying to sell you something. I'm not just trying to make you join something. No, I'm trying to introduce something to you that's ultimately going to save your life and mine. And we can have fun doing it. We can enjoy each other's company while doing it. And it's better days ahead of us while we start to struggle and go towards this road of liberation. But I think that it's necessary again, and I can't emphasize it enough, that we study and we examine all kinds of matters of people in within the different classes, even in the rich class. You know what I mean? And that's why I think Mr. Freer is bringing out here how when he mentioned the oppressor, you know, he feels as though when he comes down to our level, he's being oppressed now. So we see all these different dynamics, and we understand that it's a work because we're dealing with human beings, right? Personalities, you know, little twitches and all that other kind of stuff, right? And I've heard Elder mention many a times how the human being, and I'm starting to see that now. It's an interesting creature, you know what I mean? Because its experiences or our experiences as human beings, it ultimately I don't want to say dictate, but it narrates our reality. So the things that we've been through, our experience again, uh, is what kind of makes us tick, if you will. You know what I mean? So I think that it's very important. That's why I try to stay close to my nieces and my nephews. You know what I mean? Because you know they're in that age bracket. You know what I mean? They're getting there. And you know, I give them a little bit. You know what I mean? I don't bombard them with it because I know they want to play video games. I know they want to carry on and you know horseplay and all that kind of stuff. But I try to give them little nuggets here and there because again, as Elder taught me and told me that they are the next doctors and lawyers. And I mean, they're the future actually, and they're responsible. Even Vladimir Lenin mentioned that in a task of the Youth Communist League. He mentioned how they're responsible for establishing it. You know, our generation or the older generation before us was responsible for overthrowing the bourgeois, or even not even overthrowing them, but making everybody view the aristocratic class as distasteful. In other words, making us hate them. But we see that didn't happen. But now we're in the position now because we're soon to become the elders to the youngins. We have to put in the youngins' mind to hate, to dislike. I mean, strongly dislike, which is hate the ruling capitalist, the ruling class. That's our job. So therefore, when they get into position and they're educated and they're ready to go and they're ready to do something, right? They've been organized, then they'll eventually establish a communist society. They'll eventually establish the kingdom of God. So, you know, it's a process, you know what I mean? And we understand, like Mr. Freer was saying, we have to be occupied with the process and preoccupied with the process in order to get it done. Because we know that the capitalists, they like New York City, they ain't sleeping. You know, they up day and night doing what they have to do in order to keep the people from being human, to dehumanize the people. They're up constantly day and night with these efforts. So we have to be you know, as much vigilant, even more, to do the same. But did anybody want to bring something out?
Yeah, I definitely want to add that part is, so as we learning the dialogue, when we saying, as we saying hate the capitalists, we have to explain that as far as when we exposing the evil, like the scriptures say, hate the evil, you love the good. And so that's part of the deal. When Lenin was arguing, the capitalist deeds, what they're doing, the class, the system must be thoroughly exposed. You see, this is what Freire is explaining, exposing the problem, causing the oppressed to recognize the problem and recognize that there is a problem. That's what they got to recognize, that there literally is a problem. And why? Why does this problem exist? That's very important. It's very crucial in the ministry. Because one thing that I find when I recently talked to security guards and who you know, they in these schools because of the violence. And when they communicate and build relationships with some of these youth feel they're lost. They don't have, like they would say, some of these youth feels no hope for me. Because what I'm learning is that because of their present condition And it's been going on for, I don't know, for the last 400 years for the vast majority of poor people. But even more so for those whose family been destroyed. They don't really have anything to live for. So they really don't care if they die. They live for the moment. They let me wear the jury today. I might go to jail tomorrow. It's a badge of honor. I might go down in a gun blaze, but I'll be remembered. That's how they live. That's how they think. They've been taught to think that way. They don't have anything to live for. And when I hear them say that, remind me of a movie I seen years ago, and many of us may be familiar with it, A Menace to Society. And I remember a clip in there where the grandfather asked the boy Cain, you know, who seen his father kill somebody. He said, do you care whether you live or die? Now, seeing that the producer put that in his film, that says a lot. Do you care whether you live or die? And the character in the film said, at that moment in time, he didn't know. Now that's a problem. You know, so, now our education and our understanding of these things is very important, because through the grace of God, maybe we can build a world. We can begin to bring forth a vision of a world that they want to live for, that they want to create, and let them know they have a power to create it. We're not going to sit up here and just wait for the ruling class to do it. No one believes they ever will. So this idea, this confidence, this idea of this victory, they must see the vision, because the scripture says, where there is no vision, the people perish. And that's why it's so important for the educators to explain this thoroughly, because if they have no vision, no insight of it, what's the use of anything? So education and us learning is more than what we know, and getting out here and doing the best we can, and even better than that, praying to the Almighty, let us be successful in this mission, because, right now it's just disparity all over. I'll yield.
Awesome stuff, Elder. Yeah, man, awesome. You took me back with that movie as well. Yeah, but that was great, man. That was really, really good. Did anybody want to add to Elder? Okay, no worries. I'm gonna go a little bit more. I know we're getting close around to that time. It's 10:21, so I'm gonna read a couple of more pages, and then I'll stop, and we can have some more dialogue, and we can pick up next week. But because I want to bring out some words too in the next paragraph. But I just want to go back over what was mentioned. Not go back over what was mentioned, but just pick up the sentence again so we can get the whole thought. On page 35, the second paragraph, it reads, excuse me, only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic ways of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect the structure of domination. One of these characteristics is the previously mentioned existential duality of the oppressed. And existential, if you look up in Merriam-Webster, it just means of or relating to, right? The duality of the oppressed, who are at the same time themselves and the oppressor whose image they have internalized. Accordingly, until they concretely discover their oppressor and in turn their own consciousness, they nearly always express fatalistic attitudes towards their situation. And I want to bring out the definition of fatalistic. I thought that was interesting, but I want to talk about this whole paragraph briefly as well. But fatalistic or fatalism, a doctrine that events are fixed in advance so that human beings are powerless to change them. That's what we were just talking about. Elder just mentioned. That's why I thought that was awesome when he brought out about how they don't have anything to live for because they feel as though that everything is fixed and it's set up the way it's supposed to be. So, it's a lack of hope. It's just, just despair, right? False hope, if anything, right? It also says a belief in or attitude determined by this doctrine, right? And I thought that was interesting. The belief or the attitude determined by the doctrine. Well, what doctrine is that? And I mean, is that the doctrine of the scriptures? Do we believe we can do nothing else because that's what the scriptures are saying? Is nothing else or no way out of this? Is that doctrine coming from the scriptures, or is that doctrine coming from the capitalists and coming from their ideologies that we can do nothing about it? But I want to read some more. But real quick, I like when he mentioned one of these characteristics is the previously mentioned existential duality of the oppressed, right? So the oppressed is going through like this double-mindedness, almost, if you will, right? And we know that a man is double-minded, unstable in all his ways, right? We know the scripture tells us about that. But it says, who are at the same time themselves and the oppressor, whose image they have internalized, accordingly until they concretely discover their oppressor and in turn their own consciousness. So in other words, because they've internalized the way of the oppressor, you know, as we go through this liberating phase and we start to free ourselves, we start to free the oppressed, because we still have the ways of the oppressor, we start to see his characteristics within us, and then we see it in our consciousness. And what he's saying is that it makes us double-minded. So in order to really like Eldos mentioned earlier, and Mr. Frills mentioned as well, to really come into communion with the brotherhood, or to come in comradeship, as he mentioned in this paragraph, we have to again reflect, and we have to go into our conscious. We have to, and once we go into our conscious, we have to rid it of things that are unprofitable. We have to rid it of different things that we learned from the old social order, or that we learned from the current social order. And we have to apply things which come from the communal good, or the commonwealth of all men. We have to replace those thoughts, in other words, because if not, we still have the thoughts or the sentiments, or we have the perspectives of the oppressors. And it's actually not strange, because we've been oppressed for so long. So we have that ideal that we have nothing to live for. We have the ideal that if we are going to live for anything, it's women, it's cars, everything that the oppressor give us, money, guns and drugs. This is what we, have to live for, because we've internalized the ways of the oppressor. So we have to, as we begin to educate ourselves and we reflect and we start to take action, right? We have to fill our minds through education with hope, not hopelessness, but with hope, right? With thoughts that basically animate us, not no longer being inanimated, right? But things that make us propel ourselves forward to this daunting task, which is to liberate ourselves and mankind. But you see where he mentioned how they must discover, right, their oppressor, and in turn their own consciousness. In other words, their oppressor is really in their minds, their consciousness, right? Their consciousness is, I was talking to Elder about this not too long ago, about that ability to be aware, the awareness, right? So, or your consciousness, that reflection, thinking back on something, pondering on something. So when they ponder on their thoughts, they'll see that the oppressor is in their thoughts, because again, Mr. Freer mentioned that no human action is actually human unless we reflect. So once we reflect, we'll see the oppressor in our thoughts, and therefore we can rid the oppressor out of our own selves, right? It goes on to when let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. I mean, it goes back, putting on the Christ consciousness. We heard that mentioned earlier by the elder as well. Putting on this Christ consciousness. You know what I mean? Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. So we have to start replacing the fundamentals of what you want to call ontology. We have to start replacing it with the Christ mind, or we have to start replacing it with the God mind, or the communion or common good mind. I think Mr. Lennon had mentioned that is when it comes to moralities. I heard Akish mention morals, like he was saying something to the effect of he didn't know that the stuff he did was politically wrong, but he knew that it was morally wrong. And Mr. Lennon mentions that how there's no morality outside of this task of getting us to the common good. There's no outside morality. You know what I mean? Morality is only found in the liberating struggle of human beings. So morality solely deals with getting hope back to young folks and young men and women. That's the only morality that there is. There's no subjective morality. You know what I mean? The morality should be a collective morality. We all have that same common focus. So I'm just, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I'm just saying, as we start to educate ourselves, we see the necessity for collective thinking, right? And that collective thinking can ultimately, from what I'm understanding, it can ultimately lead us to a place where we can understand one another, and we won't be so easily to in other words, charge one another or blame each other, but we'll start to see the causation. Where is this cause coming from? Young brothers dying, young sisters, whatever, getting hooked on drugs. We'll start to see where the cause is when we start to think collectively and not look at each other as, oh, they just dumb, they just inanimate, they can't do it, because then we have taken on the oppressor's mentality. So we have to have that sense of constantly encouragement and that sense of hope. You know what I mean? That sense of, like Elder just said, out of the scriptures, that we have to have that vision, because if not, then we if we don't have that, then I'm arguing that we might have ourselves internalized the ways of the oppressor. We think that, oh, these young folks, they ain't just no good, they can't do nothing, they ain't gonna get it, forget about it, it's over. You know what I mean? That's the way the oppressor thinks, that everybody's stupid, he's the only smart person, and nobody else can lead this revolution but himself. But we can't think like that. You know what I mean? So we have to learn, and we have to study, and we have to come to that morality point where, as though the morality is centered around the common good, which propels, or which not propels, excuse me, but the common good, which incorporates everyone, despite race, color, creed. It brings everybody into it. I like when the scripture says, bringing all thoughts into the obedience of Christ. So even though people have different experiences, through the grace of God, about us coming out with the teachings and educating the pedagogy, right? By us educating the masses, we can bring all those thoughts and those experiences, right? Or those experiences which created those thoughts, we can bring them into the obedience of Christ, right? And then thus having the Christ consciousness as a collective. Okay, but did anybody else want to add something? Okay, no worries. Going right along. Excuse me. Oh yeah, did I bring out the definition for fatal? I did for fatalistic. Okay. I want to read this little part that he has, right? This little piece. It says, the peasant begins to get encouraged. Excuse me. The peasant begins to get courage to overcome his dependence when he realizes that he is dependent. Until then, he goes along with the boss says. Excuse me. Let me read that again. It says, until then, he goes along with the boss and says, what can I do? I'm only a peasant. And it says, when superficially analyzed, this fatalism is sometimes interpreted as docility. Okay. And we know the word docility, if you look at it, it sounds familiar because it comes from the word docile. But again, I looked that word up as well. And docile goes into, it's an adjective, and it goes into easily taught in the Merriam-Webster. I like the second definition better, because the second definition says easily led or managed, right? So again, now, real quick, I want to get fatalism. And fatalism is a doctrine that events are fixed in advance so that human beings are powerless to change them, right? So in other words, they can't be independent, right? I'm gonna read it again. When superficially analyzed, this fatalism, or this doctrine that events are fixed in advance so that human beings are powerless to change them, is sometimes interpreted as docility, or people who are easily managed or easily led. That is a trait of national character. Fatalism, in the guise or disguise of docile or docility, is the fruit of an historical and sociological situation, not an essential characteristic of people's behavior, right? Notice that. I'm gonna go back to that, but it says it almost always is related to the power of destiny or fate or fortune, right? Inevitable, inevitable forces, or to a distorted view of God, right? So, and let me keep reading before I go into that. But it says, under the sway of magic and myth, the oppressed, especially the peasants, who are almost submerged in nature, see their suffering, the fruit of exploitation, as the will of God, as if God were the creator of this organized disorder. And I just, when I read this, I know we all, scripture just bounce off everybody's mind, probably, of course. But I underlined the part when it says, the fruit. It says, let me read it again. Fatalism in the disguise or guise of docility is the fruit of an historical and sociological situation, not an essential characteristic of a people's behavior. And the reason why I start to understand why he said historical, right, and sociological, but mainly historical, is because, again, we're going into class struggle, right? Remember, because fatalism showed us, I'll read it again. That's what I got from it, and God willing, we can dialogue, and others, brothers and sisters, might bring something different. But it says a doctrine that events are fixed in advance so that human beings are powerless to change them. A belief in or attitude determined by this doctrine. So it's events that took place by men from centuries before, right? We can go back to Nimrod and others, right? That it's supposed to be, peasants, and it's supposed to be kings, right? It's supposed to be rulers, and it's supposed to be workers. And this doctrine, or this kind of fixed event in society, created class struggle since the beginning of society. When we start to read books of antiquity, and we start to look at past societies and past civilizations, we see that these events have been fixed in society where it's class. So you have different people in different classes, and ultimately you always have a hierarchy, right? And he said that's why he mentions that is this docility, fatalism in disguise of docility, people easily be led, is the fruit of an historical and sociological situation. It's a situation. In other words, it's I don't want to say a problem, but yeah, it's a problem. It's a situation. It's something that needs to be attended to. It's a situation. And I mean, whatever you emergency, right? Not an essential characteristic of people's behavior. So in the beginning, when we look at Genesis, we don't see domination. We don't see hierarchy. We see God telling man to be fruitful and multiply. Again, we all know the story. We've been over it a couple of times. And I mean, through the grace of God, us having eyes to see and being able to, read and analyze things, we know that the book of Genesis, God has given man the layout on how to live in the land and subdue it and be fruitful and multiply on it. So this event that's fixed in society of class struggle, it wasn't always in the beginning. It's not a characteristic of human behavior. It's not a natural one, right? It's something that has been inserted, right? It's something that has been inserted by man, but it's not a natural thing which man just, in the beginning he had it. It's something that man ultimately led, or ultimately men started to teach itself through certain knowledges how to dominate others, but that's not something that's natural, right? But I want to keep going. It says
Hold on before you go forward, because it appears that what he's explaining as well as this, the fatalist attitude that comes from domination. He's saying that isn't inherent. It isn't an essential characteristic of people's behavior. They've been taught to be what appears to be docile. And this is what he's explaining, how the people have been taught to yield and to be easily manipulated and moved. And that's what he's saying. It did come from class.
I see that, Elder.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Excuse me.
So it came from domination, but he's explaining here that, listen, this mentality, this attitude that people have today, which is the fruit of exploitation, people haven't always been that way. And he's showing how it's got so bad, it has become so bad, as you read, that they have a distorted view of God. So we here today, we like this because of the curses. But because we don't really understand how society works, when people say that, and even when others hear the so-called Israelites say that, it's hard for them to fathom, because they're not explaining the processes, what led to what. It's almost like, okay, the great God who sit on the throne in the sky waved the wand, and therefore we can't produce anything because we've been cursed. So that's what he's saying, is this distorted view of God. Instead of understanding it comes from God by way of our own actions. And through repentance, we could change it, But to this very day, they have that mentality. Especially you find this among the Hebrew Israelite, the idealistic Hebrew Israelite. Oh man, we ain't nothing you can do. We cursed. We have to wait till Christ come and get us out of this. That's what I think of what he's saying here as well. I yield.
No, I would agree, Elder. Thank you, man. I appreciate that because I was seeing that totally different, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't seeing it in the right way. But no, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. I'm definitely I'm actually trying to reread it real quick to see even how you noticed that. But yeah, no, that was great. Elder, can you explain that one more time to me? I'm sorry. Well, I guess if you don't you can't well, not if you can't, but if you don't want to, I'll ask you later. But man, if you don't mind, can you explain that one more time to me, please?
Yeah, he's talking about, let's say back on the page, the end of the paragraph. He said it almost always is related. Well, let's go. Fatalism is the guise, in the guise of docility, is the fruit of an historical and sociological situation, not an essential characteristic of people's behavior. So this idea of the people being easily, pretty much don't have any hope, it's just the way things are.
Got you. Uh-huh.
Is that it almost always is related to the power of destiny or fate or fortune. So again, this was the deal with the gods, or whether it was in Egypt, whether it was in Babylon. The king, like you were saying, the king ruled and the peasants worked. That's just the way it is. And this is how God ordained it. It was the ideology of slavery, with the misunderstanding, or the deliberate, possibly misunderstanding, of curse be Canaan, where they switched it from Canaan to Ham. And so therefore the Negro is destined to be a servant or a slave. And they developed this psychology. This is it. This is our lot under the sun. This is what we're supposed to do. And then he said, under the sway of magic and myth, the oppressed, especially the peasants, who are almost submerged in nature, see their suffering, the fruit of exploitation, as the will of God. So the suffering or the fruit of exploitation, that is the historical and sociological situation. This was the situation that created this psychology, or this mentality inside of the people. And now they're looking at it as the will of God, as if God were the creator of this organized disorder. You see, so we're not looking at it as problem solving. It's a disorder here. That's why we're oppressed. We're in the ghettos. It's not just because it's this type of abstract idea, or just because we're Israel. I heard one guy say years ago, he's known, a big figure in the community. And I remember sitting at the table with them, and he said, they took us from Africa and they brought us in here because we were Black. No, I mean, it's just as bad. Well, we're slaves. We was enslaved. We sick. We in prison more than everyone else because of the curses. God have cursed us. So let us go back and keep the commandments. But yet, the commandments they resort to is ritual, Sabbath day, and all this other stuff like we talk about, because they don't recognize the disorder of the society. This is why this is happening to us, not because God waved the wand and bound us here against our will. No, we fully have something to do with our condition, and we fully have something to do to get out of this condition. And I think that's what he's talking about, this fatalistic mentality where we feel we can't do nothing. We're bound. We are simply hopeless in our situation. I'll yield.
Thank you, Elder. I appreciate that, sir. Thank you, man. Thank you. Did anybody else want to add anything else to that? So really quickly, at the end of that, when he had mentioned as if God were the creator of this organized disorder, I thought about the scripture when it says God is not the author of confusion. I wanted to get that real quick. Also, I know the scriptures mention that let everything be done in decency and or let everything be done decently and in order, right? But the reason why I wanted to get 1 Corinthians 14:33 is because I happened to look up that word disorder. And I want to read 1 Corinthians 14:33 and see if we can follow my thoughts. You know what I mean? Just a little bit of my thought. But it reads, verses 33 reads, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. And I found that interesting. It says, but of peace, right? But of peace. And I want to read the definition of disorder to y'all real quick. So if we read it as a verb, it says to disturb the order of, or to disturb the regular or normal functions of. But when we read disorder as a noun, notice it says number one, the lack of order, right? But the second one is the one I took note to. It says breach of the peace or public order. So when we go back to 1 Corinthians 14:33, for God is not the author of confusion or disorder, but of peace. And this disorder is a breach of peace or public order. So, and the reason why I thought that was just so dope and awesome is because I'm thinking that disorder just meant whatchamacallit. Again, just like taking the words for granted. I'm thinking that disorder just means to disturb the order, like Merriam-Webster said, or to disturb the regular normal functions of something, right? Just to but no, it goes into a breach of peace. And we know that God is not the author of confusion, but making peace. You know what I mean? So I just thought that was very interesting, as well as what Elder was bringing out, because uh we now understand, now at least I understand, that this is something that human beings have inherited over time. They haven't always been this way. I didn't even pay attention to that. So it was like a revelation for me, or a light bulb turning on, that, no, human beings haven't always been able to be so led and managed easily like that. That's something that has happened over time. That is something that we've learned. And I thought about this education again, how in the systems, or these school systems that the oppressors have established, these institutions of oppression, if you want to call them, the high schools, the colleges, they train you before you come out in 12th grade. They train you to be docile. They train you with the fatalist ideology. They train you with that. Think about it. All through school, they train you with that. They train you to be sheep. They train you to be led. You know what I mean? And then led to what, though, is the question. And we know what they train us to be led to. But this is why I was speaking to Elder about this not too long ago. This is why we have to again go after education constantly. And education is also what I'm starting to realize. Again, Mr. Frears mentioned it. It is the part of becoming human, right? To come out of ignorance, because when we're ignorant, then we're easily led. We're docile. You know what I mean? When we're ignorant, then we become objects and things, because we're ignorant. We don't have education. So the education is the process of becoming human, right? If I were to argue, I would say it's the process of becoming human. But now we see the education that we have been given, it's all been destructive. It's all been surrounded by sadistic or sadism or necrophiliac, making us dead and animate. That's all the education that we've been getting, right? So now we need some education that animates us. We need reflection. We need human action, which causes the reflection, which causes us to become human and lead ourselves into liberation. So,
And I want to say, as we're saying it, to just like Elder had told me, when we explaining things, he would tell me, listen, be mindful to always bring to the people, because you have to say it, and that is class struggles. And the reason why I'm saying that is because even what we're saying now, when we say we need to be educated, well, it's very important to realize also that we are being educated. And so what we definitely want to take from this is that those of us who sitting at the table to eat and educate, be educated. What we're reading now is a call for us to educate others. Because it's important to realize that, because sometimes we could just sit down and eat and just sit at the table and just sit at the table and just sit at the table because we're educating. We're being educated, in other words. Okay, so now in our position, we have to realize now the objective is to educate the oppressed. So we have begun to walk the road of education. And so now we have to understand the importance, the dire need to intervene in the public, to educate. Because as he continues, God willing, you probably go over it next week. He says, submerged in reality, even though it's a false reality, he's still talking about submerged in reality, the oppressed cannot perceive clearly the order which serves the interests of the oppressors whose image they have internalized. Okay, so we're beginning to see it. So when we start to read this book, now we have to think of the other now. And that's why we want to keep that on our forefront, because we don't mention that. Sometimes it could just be us being educated. And we do. We should have to be educated. But we have reached a level of education now where, okay, simultaneously, some of us have reached a level where as we continue to learn, we must take the next step in the praxis of being educators. Because now we have those who are oppressed who haven't even made it to this position yet. They still can't even perceive clearly the order which serves the interests of the oppressors. Thus, because they're in that confusion, he said, chafing under the restrictions of this order. They're being bound by this yoke. Under the restrictions of the order of this social system, they often, the oppressed, the ignorant of the oppressed, who haven't even made it this far to in the learning as the Most High allowed us to get. He said, under these restrictions of this social order, they often manifest a type of a horizontal violence, striking out at their own comrades for the pettiest reasons. And there you get the violence, the conflicts, the tumults. You know, we say, well, you know, he shot him just because he stepped on his sneakers. You know, then, you know, now that's why I'm just bringing to our attention as we read it. Because we may think it, but we also have to make it known. We have to voice it. Listen, we have been blessed with a certain level of education. We pray that the Most High will even educate us more. But now what we're reading in this text right now, we're talking about people who haven't even made it this far. And so we have to really get up on deck and being intentional and experimenting now to let's see if we can begin. That's our experiment. You know, that's technically our homework. We read this, we contemplate how and what that next person we may see, that next person who we may carry on a dialogue with, carry on the practice so they can get to the stage when they can begin to perceive this order or this organized, quote, he said, quote, organized disorder. All right. So these people submerged in this type of order must be made, it must be made clear to them. I just want to bring that to our attention. I don't know if you was going to get into that this week or next week, but it's something that, you know, just hearing the dialogue and hearing the talk is just another way to encourage, hey, we're learning. That is good. But now many of us are at a position, are at a stage where we must step out and begin to use what the Most High have showed us thus far in a praxis for discipling. I'll yield with that.
Yes, sir, Elder. And I'll stop it right there. But real quick, somebody, I want to add on to what you said. But did somebody else want to bring something out?
Yeah, that made me think of when Christ sent the disciples out without personal script. What message were they going out with? They were finally ready to go out with what they learned. And it definitely, I know this isn't about that. But it had nothing to do with him being crucified and resurrected. It was about this movement, about the upliftment of the people, just like what his mom had received from the angel in Luke 1, that, how to send the rich away empty. And so this is the message, and they were finally ready. So when Brother Judah brought that out, that just made me think of that. I yield.
Yes, sir. Was there anybody else? Oh yeah, so no, just really quickly, I don't want to chop it up and paraphrase it wrong, but I'll just, go to it a little bit, try to bring it out. But it reminded me of what Mr. Lennon had mentioned in the Communist Youth League, Task of the Youth League, when he said that there's been this divorcement from textbook to material world. So we read a lot of things in books and we educate ourselves, but when it comes to applying it in the concrete world, we've divorced that. You know what I mean? So we have to remarry those two things back together. Okay, well, because that's what we learn inside these capitalist institutions, like the schools, the grade schools. We learn to, you study this biology and stuff like that, or you go to college and get a degree in, biology or whatever it is that you major in, and you take it out into the material world and you practice it. So the same goes for us who aspire to be communists, who aspire to be leaders and educators, is that we take what we read on the textbook and no longer divorcing it, but actually bringing it to the asphalt, boots on the ground. So yeah, I appreciate that, Elder, because that's always constant in the back. Well, it should be in the back of our minds. I know it is in minds, that all the things that we've learned, and this just ain't no, information that, you hoard to yourself and you don't tell nobody about it. You got it locked up somewhere. No, this is something that, and it don't necessarily have to be brought out on social media or on different media platforms. It could be actually introduced to people with just, dialogue, at the coffee shop or wherever. You know what I mean? At our jobs, at our occupations, it could be something that be brought out, but it's necessary that we try to go towards study groups and different types of education projects in order to take what we've learned and get others to the point that we're at. So that way we can all be, on one accord, talking the same conversation. Because again, all of our minds, thinking the same thing. And we're, it's really hard to tell who's who. It's really hard. You don't, because I always thought about a group where as though, and that's what I get from the NMP. I get that feeling that we're a group, even though we have elders, but we're a group where everybody in class is, I mean, brilliant. Everybody brings scriptures, everybody bring references. And we've seen it, time and time and again on Thursday evenings where we discuss things where everybody just brings so much wealth of information. So, it's really hard to tell who's who. It's not like really there's a leader or something like that. Even though we have elders, of course, I'm not saying that, but it reminds me of that group that's just a classless group. You know what I mean? Nobody's over nobody. They're all one. They're all, functioning as the body. You know what I mean? One hand wash the other, both hands wash the face, as they would say. But no, I really appreciate what you brought out, Elder, keeping that in the back of our minds that, once we have that certain amount of know-how and that knowledge, man, it's time to take it to the community, take it to next door. You know what I mean? But yeah, I yield on that. But I'll conclude the reading for this evening, and then next week I'll do a light recap and then just finish out because chapter 2 is almost upon us, and I'll finish it out next week, and we should be good to go with our next reader. But I appreciate the time, and thank you everybody for joining me. Did anybody else have any closing remarks or words? Okay, so Elder, I'm guessing what I'll do is I'll close it out, and we'll still be on. I'll just stop the recording. Again, shalom to everyone. This was our 7th installment of the book reading of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We appreciate the time, and shalom to everyone.